Welcome to another episode of Tech Noise, brought to you by abstract.tech. I'm Brian Bogus, and I'm here with my co-host,
Eric Reitzer.
And today we're again going to talk a little bit about AR and VR. And over the last couple episodes, we've talked a lot about how it applies to safety. So for this show, we actually decided to bring on a safety aficionado. So with that said, our featured guest today comes to you from Ames, Iowa. If he was a beverage, he would be a full 2-liter bottle of ginger beard. This man has a beard so red that when you shine a flashlight through it, all cars immediately stop. It measures at an impressive length, which is 4 inches taller than our co-host, Eric Reitzer. Please welcome the co-founder of the Safety Justice League, aka Redbeard, Nathan Braymen.
Oh my God. Yeah, actually, a little known fact, my beard is exactly 1.3 Jason Maldonado's high. In length.
Yeah. Well, we have one of those here too, which is Eric. And Nathan, thank you so much for joining us. I'm actually really excited. When we've talked a lot about safety, we've tried to find someone who has kind of gone out there, voiced their opinion, talked a lot about some of the issues going on in the world of safety. And as you and I have talked a lot about gaming, you are pretty much the ideal fit for us. So thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
If you don't mind, I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of your experience in the safety world and what you've seen so far and kind of what you've seen as of late.
Yeah, well, I actually transitioned from being a firefighter. I was a firefighter in the U.S. Marine Corps, and then ended up getting injured, wasn't able to continue as a firefighter, and started looking into becoming an arson investigator because I thought that would be a cool job. And then I looked into the market, and there are virtually zero jobs available at any given time for that, and they don't pay that well. And I thought, okay, maybe there's something better. So I started looking around, especially at my local college, Iowa State University there in Ames, Iowa. I'm living in Ankeny now, just to the south a little bit. But I saw in their programs occupational safety. So I decided to start up, and I got my bachelor's degree from ISU. And then I also got my master's degree from ISU. I just kind of stuck around and kept going. So, and then right after I graduated, I started at a company called Berkshire Hathaway Energy. And I've been there for 8 years as the safety performance manager. So that's my full-time gig. And that's an interesting place to work because I work as a kind of a corporate safety manager role. And there are 15 subsidiary businesses in various different industries that are owned by Berkshire Hathaway Energy. So I actually get to dabble in many different industries. And so it kind of has given me, more of a unique perspective. Like I'm not really big into being in the trenches, into the safety compliance. Like I can look all that stuff up if I need it. But to be able to see different strategies at different types of businesses and different industries, to see what works and what doesn't work, or what works better than other things, I think has been a very good education for me. So
what do you think about? We dive in a lot about safety, and we'll get into the gaming aspect, all the fun stuff in a little bit. But like the general landscape right now. I mean, when people are coming on board to any company, and I'm not saying just yours, what does the general training look like when someone has to learn how to be safe inside the workplace?
Yeah, it varies drastically depending on the business, depending on the safety manager, and the industry. One of the problems is so there's different regulators, right? For training in MSHA, there's certain basic bare minimums that you have to different training you have to go through just to go into the mine. Even if you're not an employee, if you're just visiting, you have to go through this like standard basic safety training, which is pretty fascinating. But you're going to get, it's just like anytime you go to any place and you go through their training, it's going to be wildly different. And I do think one of the things I have noticed is that onboarding is usually lacking in most places. Like there's just not enough time put into, especially the safety aspect of it. And I think part of that is businesses are trying to run leaner. Like, for example, the way that it used to be done with linemen you'd have linemen come in, and then they would apprentice under other linemen that are ready to leave. But you get that overlap where they're going to pass on that knowledge, that expertise. But in order to try to improve the bottom line, what's happening now is they won't hire anybody until the previous person is completely out of the company. So there is no more overlap or passing on of that knowledge.
Interesting. Yeah, it's funny because I mean, we talk a lot about experiential learning. I mean, we pretty much beat it to the ground at this point about how important experiential learning is, and that's really the act of doing. For us, we found ways to utilize things like virtual reality training to fill that gap and to offer experiential learning. But you bring up a really good point because even with that type of training that we try to push, um, real world activities and tasks we still think are absolutely crucial to that process of experiential learning. And when you take out that apprentice model, I think that whole thing gets lost, right? And that knowledge transfer and retention kind of goes out the drain. And I think that's when we start leading into probably, I would assume, safety problems. Is that right?
Oh yeah, exactly. That's exactly right, and that's exactly what I've seen in many ways. Um, it's interesting because safety is a subcategory of operational excellence. Um, people getting hurt, it's just errors that are hurting people. But there are other types of errors, right? Errors that hurt people are one type of errors, but there are many other kinds of errors. And I think the most effective safety programs are focusing on building up a system to improve overall operational excellence, like putting tools and systems in place that overall improve operational excellence. And if you improve overall operational excellence and operational discipline, not discipline as in punishment, but self-discipline to achieve mastery, um, you end up with fewer injuries as a result of that. And I think a big part of that, honestly, is, well, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but you end up with this situation where you have this hyper focus on the bottom line, and that becomes the main focus. And then what I've seen is that because of that, they start cutting these things that have been improving their operational excellence over time, such as having the overlap of those different employees. And then not only do you see injuries going up, you see significant types of injuries going up, like the ones that could have killed somebody or do kill somebody. And then you also see all kinds of errors happening, like little errors that have really bad consequences, like shutting off power to like a major customer, things like that.
Hmm. I start thinking a lot about safety because there's so many different ways that people approach it. One thing I find fascinating is just the total inconsistency across companies and just different divisions of the same company. I mean, I've been on a rig where it was almost like anything goes, and people, I saw someone working with a toothpick in their mouth and no real PPE because it was really hot, right? And then I went onto a corporate like building, and they made me, I couldn't walk with my phone in my hand. If I went upstairs, I had to have my hand on the handrail, and I couldn't be talking with people. And it was like I almost felt like a toddler,
Wow.
walking around this corporate complex because they were so strict. I had to follow these lines going through the parking lot. It was like at some point I almost felt like I was in a labyrinth trying to figure out which color I'm supposed to follow to get to the building. And I just find it fascinating that I'm literally have to act like a toddler at a corporate office, but then I'm on a rig and it was like anything goes, which I would feel like you should see the opposite effect.
Yeah, those are like opposite extremes of the spectrum there.
It's just weird to me. So what you talk about onboarding, and I find that interesting because one of the questions I had for you is around like what the weakest area of safety training is, and you mentioned onboarding. Do you feel like companies now, because not only is it the bottom line and getting rid of the kind of the senior person before they bring someone on, do you feel like when companies are onboarding people, it's more about kind of the protocol, making sure they understand things like the life-saving rules, and as long as they get the thumbs up and the approval that they're ready to work? Or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, some places are like that. Some places actually do it really well, but for the most part, what I've noticed is it's all about checking off the box. A lot of companies have moved towards this computer-based training model because it's efficient and it doesn't cost that much, and they can record that this person has received this training.
But it's so boring. It's
It's
so boring.
It is so boring. so boring, and you don't retain that information. I mean, you end up just clicking through it.
Yeah, it's like defensive driving, right? Like I know every time I had to take that thing, I turned on the video of my time it was MC Hammer. Go ahead, Eric, insert your joke.
I was going to say, how many times have you done it? I mean, you said every time I've done defensive driving.
I've done it a few times. But we had these videos, and you'd have to watch like MC Hammer talking about defensive driving. Clearly, this is when he ran out of his millions, and it was just so boring, you know. And I never remembered anything. All I wanted to do was take the test so I could get it off my record, right? And that was really my goal. And all of these companies have gone to these like learning management systems, which is basically like PowerPoint and videos. And I feel like the whole why factor, the reason why people should care about safety, like saving lives, not getting injured, you know, all of these different things, I feel like it gets lost in the dryness and the boring aspects of these systems.
Yes, it does. Well, and it starts at the top. You know, businesses, it all starts with how you set your KPIs, or how do you set your company goals, I think. You know, because your KPIs, or your company goals, are going to drive consequences, right? So if you meet your goals, you're going to get 100% of your bonus, or whatever it is. But if you don't, then you're not going to. And people are consequence driven. And you know, it's sort of like you have to view safety programs through two lenses, and this applies to pretty much anything, but even safety programs, where you have the lens of principle, and then you have the lens of practicality. And the people who only view things through the lens of principles, I call those people living in gumdrop castles, because they have this idea and it's really good, but it's not that practical. They haven't really, you know, tempered it with practicality. But then you have, on the other hand, you have the lens of practicality, where if people don't start with the lens of principle and they only have the lens of practicality, I call those the Gargamels, the people who, like, you know, the ends justifies the means kind of thing. So you got to have both principle and practicality, and you have to strike a balance between those two things.
That was from the Smurfs, right?
Yeah, Gargamel from the Smurfs, exactly.
Yep. Eric's very familiar with the Smurfs. They're like his brother and sisters.
Beat me
It's his
to
brethren. It's his brethren right there.
Yeah.
Well, everyone's here, of course, to talk about emerging technology, right? So we've kind of set the stage around safety and why, you know, some of the issues, and also what people are dealing with. You know, we're in a unique time right now, not only with COVID, but just in general with all of this fantastic gaming technology. I mean, it's not just about augmented reality and virtual reality, but it's just game-based training in general really has a ton of use cases. And safety is one of those things that we talk a lot about, because it's one of those things that everyone needs to know. And it's not just the, you know, the roughnecker or the person in a manufacturing facility. It's even the corporate side. Like when they go on location, they still have to have an understanding of life-saving rules and what they need to do when they get into these facilities. So I'd like to dive in a little bit about, you know, AR and VR specifically. You know, what do you see right now inside the safety space in regards to this new technology?
Oh yeah. Well, and there's so many ideas that run through my head when I think about AR and the safety space. I have seen some very limited examples of VR being used for training applications, but a lot of it's been really lackluster. It doesn't really apply this, you know, the aspect of gaming to it. It's just sort of like they're just dabbling into it just to do it. You know, and I think that there's still a lot of resistance. Part of the problem is generational. People, when they get older, they become more crystallized in intelligence. And imagine if you're like a senior or mid-senior level executive in a big company, you forge these certain relationships with your superiors, and you've been doing things for a while now, like, you know, probably 10 to 20 years almost, doing things one way. And now you have a good salary and you're in a good position, and you maybe don't want to rock the boat or change the status quo. And so what happens is, because safety starts at the top, as I mentioned earlier, those people at the top become very crystallized and resistant to change. It's the younger generations that come in that see maybe a better way of doing things, or maybe wanting to try a different way of doing things. And the top says, no, we're not going to do it, or we'll do it later. Like the excuses I hear is, oh, we'll see how this works, and we just want to see how it looks down the road. They'll just kick it down the road, and they just don't want to have that that change. I think specifically in the like, for example, for linemen, one of the things that I've heard is these new apprentices will go out to do a job, but then they'll call into dispatch and they'll say, what do I do next? I don't know what to do. I don't understand either they don't know the rules or they forgot what to do. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there for AR. I mean, if you basically equipped, especially your younger apprentices, with AR or just a camera, eyes for the for somebody who's more experienced, that's
Yeah, like
maybe
a remote expert, right?
some remote expert. Thank you. Exactly. They could be.
Yeah.
You could have one expert viewing, kind of looking over the shoulder virtually. Any number of apprentices out in the field, and then when they get stuck, they could call in and say, "Hey, I need a little help. What do I do next?"
Yeah,
Um,
I
yeah,
think one of the other things that's interesting about AR in this space, you kind of mentioned it, where they're starting to get rid of kind of the mentor, and the apprentice no longer has someone to learn from. Another good use case for AR there is there's the ability that you can put on a wearable like the HoloLens. You can record a process that you're doing, and as you go through that, you record it all, you bring it back, and then you have basically an authoring tool, and you can ultimately build this kind of this knowledge that's in something that they can see in the physical world, right? So as they go through this process, plan A is, hey, I'm going to take this from a mentor who's done it for 30 years and use this information. And then in the event they get stuck, then they can remote in an expert and bring that person in. I think that's a great use case for AR, where this whole knowledge transfer issues happening is get as much of it logged and recorded as possible, and then now the apprentice has a lot more assistance.
yeah, exactly. And another point of resistance is people tend to be afraid of what's new, right? So they're comfortable. They don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to change the status quo. And so they don't really have much incentive to go out and try something new. In fact, they tend to fear people, just human nature in general, typically resistant or avoidant to change, or maybe it's fear of the unknown. One of my favorite stories is King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table. I mean, everyone's heard of that story. But one of the interesting insights I learned, actually, from listening to Jordan Peterson, um, his maps of meaning lectures. I used to be a big fan of Jordan Peterson and his college. He put all his classes on YouTube, and you could just listen through. It's like hundreds of hours, and I've listened through the whole thing like twice now. But one of the things he talks about was how King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, they went out to seek the Holy Grail, and the Holy Grail is just a symbol that means whatever's most valuable to you, because everyone has their own different Holy Grail probably. And so what they did is they split up. They went out individually into the forest, and the way that they decided how they were going to go into the forest was they each decided what looked scariest to them, like what was the area of the forest that looked darkest to them. So the area that they were avoiding the most is the one that they sought after, they went after, because it's that's where you're going to find the biggest value. It's not by avoiding the things you fear; it's by seeking it out. But it's counterintuitive. It's difficult to get something to do something that they deem as kind of scary. So that's another big, trying to get over that hump of that human nature of just being comfortable, not wanting to try something new.
So what do you think if, like, okay, so let's say there's a company who is trying to get into this, but they're real hesitant, right? They just don't, they lack the knowledge to embrace something like virtual reality training, right? Which, as we know and we've seen, it's the only type of technology that we can put someone in a location that you can't always get to, right? That's an offshore oil rig, or that's a manufacturing facility that you typically will have to fly someone out to. Now you can put them in there and train them. Like, we know that is a solid use case. And for safety, I mean, we can go through hazard identification. We can take them through really sensitive procedures, and we can take them through life-saving rules. And really, they can train on all of this, right? How do you get someone, or what should a company do to kind of get over the hurdle and embrace the technology? Like, what's holding them back outside of just the lack of knowledge?
Right. Well, you know, one of the things I think would be very effective in doing that, or maybe the most effective way, would be to identify mavens, or basically people who are influential, and starting up a focus group with that small group of people and having them try it, because I think, it's people don't realize how powerful it really is until you've actually tried it. For example, I took my wife and had her try the VR for the first time just this last weekend, and I had her try Richie's plank experience. Have you heard of that?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's
And so
hilarious.
she's never been in VR before, and I'm like, here, try Richie's plank experience. It's intense, and I just wanted to see how effective it was, her ability to remember that she's standing on the floor versus standing, 30 stories up on a plank, um, with no sort of protection on it. And it was really funny. I recorded it and everything. It's great. But she was
That's awesome.
tiptoeing forward, kind of, and then coming back to the elevator, and I was like blowing wind on her and stuff. And she, just to mess with her.
Did you put like a plank on the ground, make her walk the
Oh,
the 2 inch?
No, I didn't have anything that would fit, but that would be even better. But it's amazing though, because her reaction or her comments, like after the fact, was, I can't believe how real it was. And she kept having to take off the visor to look down and stuff. And I told her, jump off, to walk off the plank, as a challenge, and she didn't want to do it. And I said, just take it off and look where you are. And she's like, okay, I just got to remember. Okay. And she puts it back on. And then as she's falling, she was like screaming. And she said she could feel it in her stomach. And then before she like hit the ground in the game, she turns away,
Yep,
and
it's great. I mean,
here's
it's so effective. I mean, I saw that same experience being done, and they had a curtain around these people, and they put a board on the ground, and they put the person on the board, and they had spotters there because even though people literally stood on a 2 inch high board, when they got the VR headset on, it really put them in the moment. And when they would fall off the board, like the spotters had to grab them because they felt like they were falling. And it's interesting because you mentioned, like, I totally agree. You have to try it. And there's so many people that hesitate to try it. And I think it's kind of the unknown that you mentioned earlier.
right.
The younger generation, the ones who are training, they'll put this thing on immediately. But I get someone, not to like call out a demographic, but over the age of 50, and they don't want to do it. But I tell you what, the moment I get them to put it on, they totally understand it immediately. They quickly pick up how to move around, how to grab things, how to perform actions. We have this whole tank demo, and in no time they're turning valves and moving around, and they just have to get over the hump of this is a game, because yes, it's a game, but I got to be honest with you, virtual reality is easier to use for a non-gamer than just a regular game with a controller. Because with the controller, people struggle on how to move around, how to strafe and how to move with the left joystick and how to turn with the right one.
Sure.
But in VR, it's much more natural than that. You just kind of move and walk and reach and grab. And that's where I think it has all the promise, is that, the younger generation is mainly going to train on it, but the older generation, once they get over, this idea, this kind of fear of it being a video game, that they didn't grow up playing video games, that they're not supposed to play games.
Right.
They grab onto it and they understand it, and then they start brainstorming with me. They start throwing out a trillion different ideas, and I'm like, well, let's talk about what's real, what's possible. What can the proof of concept be? Let's take a step back and get over it. Let me ask you another question. I mean, a lot of companies pour money into training, especially around safety, because the one thing about safety, every other type of initiative is all around, hey, is it going to make me more money? Is it going to make me more efficient? Is it going to save me money? These are all things that people consider when you think about, operational budgets. When you talk about safety, when you can show data that says, hey, statistically speaking, if you put people through, a gaming-based simulation, they're going to know the information better. They're going to understand it better. It's not just about what the initiative is, but it's why you should care and how you perform it, because they're really doing it in VR. Do you think that there's a budgetary issue as well as the content creation side, like that cost aspect of it? Or do you think because it can add so much value to safety, that shouldn't really be an impact in their decision making?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't think it depends on the size of the company and the size of the budget and all that kind of thing. But to be honest with you, I don't think it's that expensive anymore. I mean, I think that in principle, for a long time, VR has had a lot of merit, and AR. But now with technology, advancing and the cost of the technology going down, I think it is now squarely within the realm of what is practical. And so now we have both like the blending of the principle and the practical. But in the safety realm, there's other barriers. I think it's a deeper problem because, again, it all starts, honestly, we just have to go deeper. It all starts with how goals are set within the company. Now, if the goal is to actually provide inputs into to do things that we know will improve safety, then people, leaders who get that, leaders who understand that goals should be set on inputs like training and having good quality training, those are the companies that should be targeted with this kind of approach to training. I think the companies that set goals on their outcomes, that set goals on this number of injuries or this number of accidents, I think those are the ones that are probably going to be more resistant, because what ends up happening is when a company sets their goals on the outcomes instead of the inputs, um, it's there's a situation where it becomes more about optics, because it's easier just to make the number look good than it is to actually improve performance. And there are all kinds of studies done there where there are entire countries, actually. They've done studies on entire countries in Northern European countries. I think it was Norway, where they would set goals on reducing the number of injuries. But as the incident rates go down, the number of fatalities will go up. And why does that happen? It's because when companies incentivize reporting fewer injuries, people report fewer injuries. And when you don't have good reporting or communication, then suddenly you have problems and hazards in the workplace that you don't know about anymore. And then those hazards kind of fester in the work environment, and eventually they kill somebody. And so it depends on the culture, and it depends on the quality of the leadership.
That's an interesting way to think about it. I mean, I think one of the issues with education in general, and I don't mean to go a little bit on a sidebar here, but like,
I love sidebars.
everyone's very focused on numbers, like how well do we perform, right? How well do we show ourselves? And I mean, this even goes all the way into the educational system with our kids. Like, schools get rewarded based off test taking. Like, how well do these kids test out? And the con with that, or the problem with that, is that it makes them focus on purely how well do they test.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about critical thinking. It's not about all these different aspects of what they need to understand. I mean, I made a reference on a previous episode around like the difference in learning a foreign language in the United States versus, let's say, in Germany, where like I had a German exchange student, and when I went to Germany to visit him, everyone spoke English. And when they get into English class, they don't get to speak German. They have to speak English, and they learn off of images and all of these things, right? Where when I took Spanish here, it was all about memorizing vocabulary words, taking a test, and then I would brain dump the majority of what I memorized, because I accomplished my goal, which was to get a passing grade on this test. And I do think that, I think you bring up a really good point, that the company's culture really has to be all about how do we make sure our people are truly safe, not how well do we look safe to the outside world and to recruits.
Exactly. I call that the church of counting things, and it drives me nuts.
That's so good, though. That's such a I just learned something on this podcast. I mean, I knew it was there, but I never knew how to really kind of structure that idea and that concept. And it really comes down to a culture thing. Like if you're trying to showcase on a whiteboard how long you've been without an incident, like, okay, you look like this, but is that really true? Or have you just stopped reporting it because you know that you'll get a demerit for doing so?
Exactly.
That sounds so counterproductive to me.
It is. And that's one of the biggest frustrations that most, or any safety pro worth his salt, that drives them nuts, because it takes away all the energy, all the momentum to the things you should be doing. There's nothing actionable about the number. Like, what is a person supposed to do when they look on a whiteboard and say, okay, we've been 15 days since our last injury? Like, what do you do about that? There's just don't get hurt. Like, that's the message. Don't get hurt. Don't get hurt. Like, that's not helpful. What's helpful is, what are the valued behaviors that I should be doing to prevent myself from getting hurt? And so that's where you look at the inputs. You go upstream and see what you're putting into the river, to change things. You can't actually change the number unless you basically just start lying about it. And that's one other thing about the generation gap here is one of the things I noticed is, especially with engineers, it's even worse. But it seems that the older generation, they care a lot about optics. And like I've never heard the word optics been talked about so much in my entire life as I have around the office. Our average age of our company when I first started 8 years ago was 55 years old. And everything's, oh, that's optics, good optics, bad optics, optics, optics. And I'm like, what the, like, who cares what it looks like? Let's just do the right things. How about, it's very
Yeah.
frustrating. And even my dad, I love my dad, but he's an engineer and he's a boomer. So, and I love him dearly. He's a really great guy. But one of the things that he said when I was looking, I was talking to him one time about like some job I was thinking about applying for or whatever. And it was a vice president level job. And he said, oh, well he goes, oh yeah, the job title matters. Like if you can get that VP, that job title, it really matters, And I'm thinking, does it though? Like, like it's all about optics and looking good.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think we need to shift away from that,
Let's be honest. Like the baby boomers are very knowledgeable. Like that's like what they bring to the table is a really, really strong knowledge base. Like they have the experience and they have the knowledge. And I think it's such a nice thing to say, okay, like let's take all of this knowledge and now let's take, people that are in the younger generation who have more experience in things like, games, and let's marry the two. And let's take your knowledge and let's make a video game out of that knowledge, because that's what's going to help this younger generation more and more and into truly how to be safe, right? I think that's important. It's not a bad mouth on the baby boomers. It's a matter of like, hey, like you have so much knowledge in there. Can we just get that and then put it into something that people can really grab onto? Because unfortunately, if you sit in front of a classroom and try to share all of this knowledge with the younger generation in a 4-hour training class, they're not going to retain, but 10, 20% of it max. So
right.
I really think it's more of like taking that information and showing more value. Well, let me ask you a question. You've talked a little bit about, this culture and how companies need to just think about being safer, not showing themselves. If you were to think about this technology, and not the AR side right now, because you kind of already touched on that about pulling that knowledge in, but from the virtual reality side, like where do you see if someone's getting involved? So here we have some people listening and they're really interested in this technology and they're in the industrial space. Like where do they start? Where do you see them starting in something like virtual reality training?
Well, I definitely think it's still pretty new. I mean, there's so much potential for it. I would start with the younger employees that they have. Like go to them and say, what are the issues you're facing? One of the biggest mistakes that people make, especially from a corporate level, and I'm in a corporate level position, and I've seen it over and over again. And what happens is people in corporate, they typically think, oh, I'm going to write a procedure or I'm going to create a program, but they do it in a silo, and they say it's almost like they assume that they already know everything, and they're just going to write it, and then they're just going to expect everyone to follow it like a bunch of robots. So the important thing is get out of your office and get on the front lines and talk to the people who are experts at their job and ask them what their challenges are. What are the things, or just make observations, just see what kind of challenges they're having, or even look at your data. What type of injuries are you having to find out where your weaknesses are? That's another way to do it. And then find the solutions by working with those employees. I think that's really where most of the answers are, the ones that are closest to the front lines.
When I picture doing things like virtual reality training, and me, we've talked a lot about this. I'm all about game methodology. Like I think that like taking your learning management system and just slapping it into a game is such a disservice to what you can do inside these simulations, right? So, I picture companies. I mean, the future to me is literally exposing this scoreboard and kind of promoting this friendly competition and how people perform inside the simulations and all this randomization coming in, so that every time someone steps into it, it's potentially different than the last time they did it, right? Like that's what you're trying to embrace. When from the corporate side, do you see companies grabbing onto that where, eventually 1,000 employees have gone through this training and you can see these kind of scoreboards and leaderboards, and it's not just about safe, but it's also about efficient, right? We can track all of that stuff. Do you see the corporate side really grabbing onto that and utilizing that, or do you see them saying, no, that's too far, we don't really want to expose all of that, we want to keep it really limited?
Well, I think that I don't see a lot of it. I think a big part of it is, again, how they set their goals, because they're not going to be interested in anything but their outcomes. They're not going to be interested in gamifying anything either. It's just basically they're kind of washing their hands of it. They're saying, okay, you guys just make sure my number looks good so I can report it up to the board, make us look good. It's all about optics, right? So if you have anybody that's so focused on optics, again, you're probably going to fall in deaf ears. But I do have hope for the future. I do think that the younger generation, the younger blood coming in, especially the generation like ours, grew up playing video games and stuff, and Gen Z, the even younger generation, they don't like walls of text. They don't like
No.
lots of words. You just
No,
get
they barely even like video now.
right. Yeah, it's just like get to it and tell me what I need to know. And I think that, like we said earlier, once you're actually in, your hands on, that's the fastest way to learn something well. And I think with that efficiency mindset of Gen Z and even of millennials somewhat, I think that it's almost just a matter of time where this is just inevitable. It's going to be coming in.
The interesting about Gen Zs, and I know we're going to save this for another podcast, so I won't get too far into it, but like they, the millennials, the early millennials were always known as the tech savvy ones, but really like it's been proven that we're more tech dependent. Like we know how to use the stuff, but we don't really know how it works. And I say me, I'm actually just a hair above, and I'm kind of in this lost generation, just slightly above millennial and Gen X, kind of right between those two. But the Gen Zs, like they're growing up learning how to program and all these things. So they're actually learning on how things work. And why that matters is when they train and when they learn, I guarantee you we're starting to see a pattern. We're starting to see this growth of that generation on, they don't want to just test out. Like they want to understand the how things work. And so when they're going through training and they're learning, like I would see them it's not acceptable to them if we're just going to say, when you see this hazard, you do this. They're going to want to almost put themselves in that setting and say, no, I want to figure it out. And I want to know how to do this stuff and understand it, not the inner workings and all of this different aspect. I think that's going to be an interesting change that we're going to see over the next decade.
Mm-hmm. And also the younger generations typically are not so hierarchical. They don't like as much bureaucracy, because that's exactly what, really long hierarchies get you, is a lot of bureaucracy and people gatekeeping information, withholding information. I think a lot of these hierarchies are going to get a lot more flat, because just for that reason, Brian. I think that people, especially Gen Z, they want to tackle problems on their own. They don't just want to defer to an authority and let them handle it for them.
It's interesting. So it sounds like the overall recap for the safety side and AR and VR and just gaming simulation in general is that step one, we need to see more of a culture shift for companies to not just worry about their optics, as you say, and how they look on paper, especially from a safety perspective, but really about making sure their people truly know how to be safe. And interesting enough, I guarantee you, as we see that shift, that companies will start actually showing better. Their numbers are going to be performing better because it's not just about the image. The employees are truly being safer, and therefore the numbers look better. And they're not faked, right? They're legit. Once they do that, now they can look at better options outside of just death by PowerPoint and test taking, to embrace this gaming technology and to put people in experiential learning like VR, let them go through this stuff and learn better. And then also when they're inside the workplace, embracing things like AR, where they can have this knowledge readily available for them from their mentors who no longer can be by their side, and they can use this technology to embrace that knowledge transfer, right? And then also have things like remote expert available, so that you can pull someone in when you need assistance. And now you kind of have someone basically beside you on an as-needed basis.
Yeah.
Is that about a recap?
That's a really good recap. And I know one thing I would add is the church of counting things, right? That tends to lead to a mindset where quantity takes priority over quality. where it's all about the facade of looking busy, looking like you're doing a lot, even though the quality may not be there. And so the shifting away from the quantity and over to quality, like there are a lot of businesses that have done it already, and but I still think the industry has a long ways to go to swing that direction. I do see positive trends going that direction, but if all you care about is how you look, then typically what you do is you just create the facade that you've done all these things when in reality they may not be done very well. So focusing on doing one thing better or doing one thing well is better than focusing and just doing a lot of things poorly.
Interesting. Well, Nathan, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone listening, you should definitely go check out the Safety Justice League. They're posting some really great information. I always follow some of their stuff on LinkedIn. Some of it's actually really funny, though it has a driven point on, you'll be shocked at some of the ways people perform their jobs and what they're doing unsafe. And I think you guys have an amazing presence. I think you're taking this modern look at safety and you're engaging people in a really special way outside of just this kind of very boring protocol based. And so your branding's great. The information y'all distribute is fantastic. And I wish y'all the best of luck.
Thank you so much. And our main goal with Safety Justice League is to really just push good information, try to pull safety into the future. And another thing that I've been working on, a project I have, is itrecordable.com. And that's just free record keeping advice. I'm certified in OSHA record keeping. I have my master's in safety. I've been doing OSHA record keeping for the last 8 years at the Fortune 100 level. And so for 15 different businesses. And so it's just a way to kind of lift that load off their shoulders so that they can take a breath, not have to worry about it so much, and just focus on the things that actually keep people safe. So I appreciate the plug.
Absolutely. And we'll make sure we put some of that stuff in the description below from the podcast.
Right on. Thanks, guys.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Honor. Take care.
All right. Bye.